amazing Australians and the story of their lives. You're tuned to Lots to Chat About with Rosemary Peterswald.
Hello and welcome, listeners. Imagine Australia 100 years ago, when there were few roads, and what roads there were often tracks, more suitable for horses than cars. What set out initially as a mission to distribute books for the Seventh-day Adventist Church from Perth to Darwin, in 1925 became a big lap around Australia for two adventuresome young men and a tiny Citroen car called Bubsie, which was the first car to circumnavigate, rather than crisscross, our vast continent. Neville Westwood and Greg Davies were initially planning to distribute their books to Darwin when they decided to keep going the rest of the way around Australia. Now setting off on the big lap, of course, today is a great adventure for people of all ages and in all sorts of vehicles. But back 100 years ago, it was literally unheard of. My guest today, Pastor David Riley, has not only completed a circumnavigation himself, but has also written an enchanting book about the adventures of Neville, Greg and Bubsie 100 years ago, called Bubsie and the Boys, the first journey around Australia by car. Welcome, David.
Yeah, g'day, Rosemary. That's a terrific introduction. Thank you for that. I kind of think I don't need to say anything else about the book because you've kind of covered everything there. Well done.
Well, we have got a lot more that we can go into, and we don't have all that much time, but we'll see what we can find out. And it's an absolute pleasure to have you here, David. Now, tell me, David, how did you first come up with the idea of this book?
Rosemary, I was on a lap around Australia myself with my wife and three kids in our four-wheel drive and off-road caravan. And it was the first of what turned out to be 3 laps around Australia with the family over a 2-year period. A great adventure that we had together as a family. And I was sitting on a beach in the Margaret River region of Western Australia. Many of your listeners would have either been there or even bought wine from the Margaret River region.
May well have, yes.
Of WA. And I was on a beach talking with an old friend who happened to be the principal of a college in the hills of Perth, the hills area. And this particular college is the same place that these 2 young missionaries had met at in the 1920s.
Wow, yes.
And he was telling me about this story from 100 years ago. Neville Westwood, Greg Davies, 2 21-year-old Seventh-day Adventist missionaries, borrowing a car from one of their brothers that was nicknamed Bubsie because it was a little baby Citroen 2-seater cabriolet vehicle, and their journey from Perth to Darwin, and then, as you said in your introduction, right around Australia. And I just fell in love with this story from 100 years ago that my friend was telling me about, and thought I need to buy a book or borrow a book on this story so I can read.
Right.
And I discovered that no book had ever been written.
Oh.
And there was just something inside me that says, said to me, David, you need to write one. And that's how the book Bubsie and the Boys came to be written.
Oh, how wonderful. Now, Bubsie, I believe, had a motor the size of a sort of ride-on lawnmower. It's incredible, David, when you read in your book, the areas that they went, the rugged tracks, it was just extraordinary that this little car could keep going. It
is. It's Bubsie, this little tiny Citroen, is the star of the story, isn't it?
Yes.
The engine is 7.5 horsepower, which is less than half the size of a modern day ride-on lawnmower. A tiny vehicle, and in fact the car is now in the National Museum of Australia down there in Canberra as a vehicle of national significance.
Isn't that wonderful?
And when you see the car, you think, how did this thing ever make it around Australia 100 years ago when most of the country didn't have any roads outside of the cities and towns?
And they were, David, they were spreading the word, weren't they, more or less? I mean, now, of course, we rely on the internet and to get to, people, whether they be in the outback or wherever. But obviously back in those days, it was all done by books. And the boys were, in actual fact, distributing books for the Seventh-day Adventist Church, weren't they, as they went on their trip? And they were received wonderfully wherever they went.
Well, back then, Rosemary, particularly in the outback, door-to-door sales was welcomed. It
Yes.
was the only way many of the early pioneers and people working on cattle and sheep stations and some of those remote towns, it was the only way they got luxuries like combs and
Yeah.
and sewing material was people on horse and cart or horseback, hawking their gear around the remote areas. And so that's what Greg and Neville did. They sold books door to door as they arrived on these cattle station and sheep station homesteads, and that was the way they were doing their missionary work as they drove from Perth to Darwin, which was what their remit was. They were asked by the Seventh-day Adventist Church 100 years ago to look at setting up a missionary outpost up there in Port Darwin.
Right.
And as they drove up and arrived in Darwin and did their work in chatting with the governor up there and doing some door-to-door sales, an entrepreneurial Citroen car dealer encouraged them for his own marketing purposes to continue travelling around Australia as a way of promoting the reliability of these French-made Citroen vehicles. And so that's what they did. They got to Darwin, did their work, and then decided to keep on driving, even though they were driving a tiny borrowed car with no
Yeah.
maps.
I was going to say they
No,
had absolutely. I was fascinated, David, as to how, because I mean, the hospitality of the stations, that they visited was just incredible. But they were huge, huge stations. One of them the size of the Netherlands, basically. How did they find their way? I mean, you might get to the front gate of the station, but could be another umpteen miles into the homestead.
well, they just follow the cattle station tracks from
Right.
place to place.
Yes.
They're also following the overland telegraph line as well. And when they arrived in a place, they would just ask for directions to the next location. So, setting out on an adventure today, often we
Yes.
want to know how we're going to get there and have all of our accommodation booked even before we leave. 100 years ago, that's not how you operated. You basically set out in faith
Yes.
and relied on the hospitality and kindness of strangers.
And they, as I said, they were particularly hospitable to the boys as they arrived. I mean, but they had to traverse, areas like the Madman's Track. And David, the car itself, I mean, it was a sturdy little car, but it had problems, didn't it? And one of the problems, of course, was they kept getting a flat tyre. Now, I just couldn't believe it when I read that they then, they sort of used their brains. What do we do now? We'll sort of fill the tyres with a few leaves and a few, bit of vegetation and whatever, and that'll keep us going for a little bit further.
Yeah, some wonderful bush mechanics that got them through with their leaky fuel tanks and dodgy gearing and dozens and dozens of flat tires that in the end they'd run out of glue and rubber patch to repair. So they
Yes.
filled it up with their tires up with vegetation to create solids. And when that was no longer working, you may remember in the book, Rosemary, that they took the skin of a killed cow,
I do. I do.
rolled that skin up into tight balls and stuffed that in their tires, and not realizing that the friction on the tires would cook the animal carcass,
Yes.
and the car stunk.
Right.
Flies swarmed to it, and the ridiculousness of two vegetarian Seventh-day Adventist missionaries traveling through the outback on tires filled with animal skin was is quite funny to think about.
Absolutely. And then, of course, they had gear problem as well. So they either had to drive in first or third gear, I think, didn't they? For a lot
Yeah,
of the time.
that
Yes.
That's right. Their gearing had a problem, and they had to rely on a blacksmith at an Aboriginal native station, what was called a
Yes.
native station 100 years ago. They needed to rely on the blacksmith near the remote town of Halls Creek up there in the Kimberley region.
Right.
And they had to wait 2 weeks for this blacksmith to be able to fashion a new gearbox for them, but they could only have first and third gear, which meant that in many places they're only traveling 10 to 20 kilometers an hour.
They were, but also for our listeners, which is incredible. I mean, sometimes the car broke down, or the tyres were out, and they were a long way away from where they could get help. So they had to walk in, and then if they were very lucky, they were given a couple of horses, and they could go back, couldn't they, to the car, and then get the car going and come back. But it was just extraordinary, the challenges that they did come up against, and they overcame. But, of course, it wasn't just the station owners who helped them. There were also the First Nations people who also aided them often, didn't they, including that blacksmith, David?
Yes, that's right. Look, there's some wonderful stories in the book about local First Nations people giving them aid. One in particular you may remember is that when they had to cross the mighty Fitzroy River up there in the Kimberley, which is a raging torrent in the wet season, and
Yes.
fortunate that they were travelling during the winter dry season, but still very difficult to cross because there were no bridges back then. But a dozen Banyaba people, the local nation up there in the Kimberley, tied some rope around the front of Bubsie, the car,
Right.
and helped drag the car across the dry riverbed so as they could continue on through to the Northern Territory. So you're right, not only did they get significant help from the cattle and sheep stations, but the local, many of the local First Nations people. And in fact, that experience with the Indigenous people there in 1925 really changed Greg and Neville. In
Yes.
fact, Neville did another lap around Australia for the Seventh-day Adventist Church the following year, where he ran dozens of health clinics
Yes.
out there in the remote area for Aboriginal people, dental work and low-level medical work.
I mean, they were a very, very industrious pair of young men. But now, David, they weren't, in actual fact, the only people endeavouring to circumnavigate our vast land, because in the end it became almost a little bit of a race, didn't it? So tell us about Marion Bell and her daughter and Joshua Warner, because they were attempting to do it at a similar time, weren't they?
Yeah, this is a wonderful part of the story, and I'm glad you've picked up on that. So when Greg and Neville left Perth, they were just farewelled by their family and by friends of their church. They were only attempting to go to Darwin, and when I
Yes.
say only, it was a 4,000-kilometre trip by car that no one had ever done before. So it was quite an adventure. But when they got up to Darwin to do their missionary work up there, two other cars, one driven by Joshua Warner, retired butcher, and another by Marion Bell, who was a very industrious entrepreneurial woman in her early 30s.
Yes.
She was taking along her 11-year-old daughter. Both
Incredible.
of those cars were leaving Perth on the same day
Yeah.
in an attempt to be the first car to drive around Australia. And there was lots of press, lots of publicity about these two cars leaving Perth to lap Australia, but none of the press or none of these cars knew about Bubsie
Right.
because there'd been no publicity about that.
Oh, yeah.
And so they didn't realise that there was another vehicle with a 4,000-kilometre head start. And you mentioned Marion Bell.
Yes.
When Marion Bell was leaving Perth on that day, the police commissioner of Western Australia tried to stop her, to tell her that she couldn't go. And the reasons was that one, she was a woman,
Yes.
and what place did a woman have back in 1925 driving around Australia?
True.
The second was that she was taking her 11-year-old daughter, also named Marion, by the way, and the
Yes.
press called her daughter Little Marion or
Marion.
Maid Marion. and the police commissioner thought that this was a terrible idea. And what I love about Marion Bell, the mum, she told the police commissioner, "There is no way you can stop me. Throw me in jail if you have to,
Yeah.
but if my husband can't talk me out of going, there's no way you can try and stop me." And so I love her attitude to the whole thing. And Marion and her daughter had a couple of guns with them.
Right.
And the newspapers were constantly wanting to know, as they got reports and telegrams back from Marion Bell, but they were constantly wanting to know what her 11-year-old daughter had shot that day.
All right.
So, so different times back then. But look, you're right. I love the story of Marion Bell and also Joshua Warner.
Well, they joined
And
up together, didn't they, for a while, but then they sort of fell out.
they fell out, and they fell out in a big way, didn't they?
Yes, yes.
And there were lots of he said, she said in the press.
Yes.
And what happened was that it turned into a three-car race between Bubsie,
Yes.
Marion Bell being driving an American Oldsmobile,
Right.
and Joshua Warner, this retired butcher, who was driving another Citroen,
That's
a much bigger Citroen than
yes.
Bubsy. And so it became a three-car race that ended up being quite close in the end,
It did.
as to who
Yes.
would win. But of course, spoiler alert:
No.
if Bubsy is now in the National Museum of Australia, you know that Bubsy came
She
in first.
absolutely made it. You're listening to Lots to Chat About. I'm Rosemary Peterswald, and my guest today is author Pastor David Riley, who has written a fascinating book called Bubsie and the Boys, the first journey around Australia by car. Now, David, talking of personalities, of course, with Marion and with Joshua, but then sadly, Neville and Greg, I mean, they started to have personality problems too, didn't they? Because I think Neville was sort of taking pretty much all the kudos, wasn't he, and getting all the publicity more so than Greg. And I think Greg got a little bit annoyed with it all.
Yeah, look, this is what happens when you travel with people. Often the first few weeks are lots of fun and lots of excitement,
Yes.
but after a few months of traveling in close quarters, personality differences can grate on you, can't they? And some of your listeners, if you've ever done travel with others, you'll
Yes.
know that various idiosyncrasies and aspects of people's personality can grate after a while. Neville Westwood, 21 years old, very extroverted, very confident in his abilities, very ambitious, and didn't mind telling you how good he was at times. And look, there's a positive to that aspect, because this drive would never have happened without Neville's can-do attitude.
And his brother's car.
And his brother's car, exactly, that he borrowed
Yes.
from his older brother. And Neville had asked Greg to come along, and Greg was great with bush mechanics. Greg had a sense of adventure as well, but Greg was a lot quieter. And so after a while, Neville's regular, I guess, skiting
Yes.
about himself and about what he could do, was beginning to wear on Greg. But I think what ended up breaking up their friendship was Neville deciding to stay in Sydney for longer than they needed to be, when Greg desperately wanted to get home.
Yes.
Greg's
Yeah.
father was unwell.
Mm.
The family farm there in 2J, east of Perth, the family farm was struggling a bit, and Greg was desperate to get home. And Neville making this decision to stay longer in Sydney than they needed to
Yes.
was the last straw for Greg. And so when they left the Sydney Adventist Hospital there in Wahroonga, in the leafy suburbs of northern Sydney, they had a falling out, and Uh, Greg said he wanted to be dropped off at Albury train station on the border with Victoria.
Yes.
Uh, Greg then caught a train. He hitchhiked, made it all the way to Kalgoorlie in the goldfields of
Yeah.
Western Australia, about 800 kilometres east of Perth. And once he got to Kalgoorlie, he bought a push bike and
Extraordinary.
bicycled all the
Yes.
way back to Perth in order to start work on repairing the family farm.
It's extraordinary. I mean, they're that they persevered just so much. It was really is I think one of the greatest stories of two young men. But now, David, tell us a little bit about your own trip around Australia, because I think you took. Did you say about 2 years? You went yourself with your family?
Yeah, that's right. 2 years with my wife and three kids. I originally told my wife it'd only be 1 year. It turned into two. Joanne, my wife, thinks that was my original plan all along. Uh, and um,
Probably was.
uh, and so that first year we took a slow lap of Australia. We followed the Murray River from its source to where it spills out to the Great Southern Ocean. We travelled the peninsulas of South Australia, the Flario, the York Peninsula, the Eyre Peninsula.
Yes.
Travelled up into the Flinders Ranges, crossed the Nullarbor, up into Western Australia, and what a wonderful part of the country WA is. The Nullarbor, the Ningaloo Reef, the Carragina Gorges, up through the Pilbara into the Kimberleys, over to Northern Territory with their wonderful swimming holes and their coastline, over to outback Queensland, and we had just such a wonderful time as a family. I then did another trip around Australia. Only took me a couple of months researching this book,
Right.
and
Right.
followed the original route for the research of the book, and then came back and picked up my family again, and we did another lap of Australia. An incredibly memorable time for us as a family. It's something that not only families do, but young
Yes.
couples, old retirees, backpackers, individuals do it. It's just a great road trip.
Look, it is, and as you said, and particularly in your case, David, a wonderful, memorable time, wasn't it for you?
Yes, it was. Yes, it was, and even more so today for us as we look back at those memories, Rosemary, because about 8 months ago we lost our eldest daughter, Jessica, who was
Yes.
17
Mhm.
at the time. We discovered at the outset of her last year of high school that she had an aggressive brain cancer. And we lost Jess within 3 months of the
Yeah.
symptoms first showing up. And we miss her deeply every day. But we look
Absolutely.
back at the memories that we have of our time together, and those memories mean so much more to us now since Jessica is no longer with us.
And fortunately, memories. Well, they can never be erased. So, our heart goes out to you, David. But it was, a wonderful, wonderful memory to have. But now, David, another Citroen, which is 102 years old, is about to make the same trip, isn't it, that Bubsie and the boys did back in 1925. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. So in 1975, 50 years after Bubsy did its trip, the same model Citroen, a 1923 Citroen 5CV, driven by a successful and famous Citroen rally car driver back in the 1970s,
Right.
by the name of Jim Rediex. And Jim's a Queenslander, by the way. He
All
had a
right.
Citroen dealership in Brisbane in the 1970s. Jim had recently won the World Cup rally in Europe and Africa.
Right.
He's the only Australian ever to have won that famous World Cup rally. And the following year, from winning that World Cup rally, was the 50th anniversary of Bubsy's achievement.
Right.
And so he took the sister car to Bubsy, around Australia to celebrate the 50th anniversary. I have that car today.
Oh, really? Right.
Yes. And my team will be driving it this year. It was originally planned to do it last year for the 100th anniversary in 2025, but when my daughter took sick, we had to obviously
Right.
delay the whole thing. So
Yes.
this year, we're taking that same 102-year-old car
Oh,
and
oh,
attempting to drive
yeah.
the original route that Bubsie took in 1925 and
Oh,
driving it around Australia, where we'll be raising money for two kids' cancer charities.
oh, how
Brainchild,
wonderful.
which
Yes.
is Brainchild is based there in Queensland, a wonderful Australia-wide
Yes.
charity based in Queensland, Brainchild. And then the other charity we're raising money and awareness for is one you're probably familiar with, which is Canteen.
Yes. Yes. That's
Uh,
what, yeah.
and yes, and
Um,
so that's what we're doing this year. So hopefully some of your listeners get to see us travelling around, particularly as we drive through Queensland later on this year.
we will certainly keep an eye out, and hopefully you'll be filming it all, will you, David?
Yes, there is we've got a social media presence. You
Oh,
can look
good.
up Bubsy and the Boys
Yes.
on Facebook or Instagram, Bubsy and the Boys, and your listeners can follow us. We're planning to set out in May of this year, the beginning of winter,
Right.
to help us get through the north of the country during the dry season.
Yes.
And I suspect we'll be coming through Queensland late June, early July.
Well, we might try and get you back on, or keep in touch with you as you go around, David, if that's all right, and get an update every now and then. But the other thing, David, which I think is terrific, is that your book is on audio and you yourself read it, because, as you know, many of our listeners are sight impaired. Not all are, but many are. So to have your book on audio is a wonderful thing.
Yes, it's on. Thank you, Rosemary, for mentioning that. It's on a number of platforms, including Audible,
Yes.
where you can hear the story. And I'm hoping that my reading of my book doesn't put some of your listeners to sleep when I do that. But no, available in bookstores, available on Kindle, and also available in audio form as well.
Terrific. Thank you, David. So now the book is called, for our listeners, Bubsie and the Boys, The First Journey Around Australia by Car. David, of course, is on Instagram, on Facebook, and you have your own webpage too, don't you, David? Which is
Yes,
called...
that's right. So your listeners can go to bubsyandtheboys.com, and that'll direct you to various areas for if they'd like to know more about this incredible story from 100 years ago that highlights not just the journey of a tiny little car
Yes.
around Australia by two young 21-year-olds, but as you know, Rosemary, from having read the book, gives a wonderful glimpse into what Australia was like in the 1920s.
Exactly.
And this wonderful pioneering spirit that many of our early settlers and also our First Nations people had back in the day.
I know. It's just, it's a wonderful book, and we're delighted, as I say, to be part of it and to hopefully be part of it during the year. But thank you, Pastor David Riley, for being my guest. Thank you, Paul, for producing. That was incredible, wasn't it?
Yes.
Amazing. And this program has been recorded in the studios of 4RPH Reading Radio Brisbane for syndication around Australia, and will be available on my YouTube channel, Lots to Chat About with Rosemary Peterswald. Thank you, David. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Rosemary.
Thank you.
Great friends and great chats. That was another Lots to Chat About with Rosemary Peterswald. Stay tuned next week for another amazing chat.